So welcome to the first Talos Takes of 2025. I'm your host, Hazel Burton. On today's show, I'm welcoming a very special guest from Talos' security research team, Vanja Svajcer, who is, Vanja, I'm gonna say it, you're one of the world's finest malware hunters.
Oh, well, thank you for calling that, but okay, so I've been around for a long time, and that's about it, really.
Here for a good time, not a long time. So I brought you on to talk about some new research that you and some of our colleagues you've been working on about vulnerable drivers. So for our listeners, probably they've heard of BYOD, but this is BYOVD, bring your own vulnerable driver. So this is something that we've been seeing popping up in incidents recently, and the team wanted to delve into what's going on in this particular threat landscape and talk about what defenders can do about it. So Vanja, for anyone who would like to understand what this thing is, what's the concept for bring your own vulnerable driver, can you give a bit of an overview into this tactic, and also why it's become a bit of an attractive option for threat actors?
Well, bring your vulnerable driver is an interesting tactic. It's something that's been around for some time already, but I personally haven't looked into it, and some of the members of our team wanted to look at it as well, because we've seen some of the threat actors, some commodity threat actors, but also some of the more advanced threat actors are using it. And the idea is that if you want to obtain the highest level of privileges to the operating systems, to the Windows, you want to be able to modify so-called kernel structures. And so the way to do it is you should be able to introduce some changes to the kernel data or some code into the kernel. And simply by a long time ago, the threat actors would do it by creating their own malicious drivers. And in the meantime, with every new Windows release from Windows XP onward, there were more and more mitigation measures in place, which would actually prevent anybody with malicious intent to create new malicious driver. So in order to circumvent that, the threat actors actually found out that Windows will still load the old legacy style drivers, and the idea of creating, or the process of creating a driver, is quite complex. And especially at the beginning, the developers were not aware of all the security implications and all the measures they need to put in place to creating those drivers. And as a consequence of that, many of the legacy drivers will have some simple but some more complicated vulnerabilities, which can be exploited by threat actors in order to conduct various things and finally place some code or make some changes to the kernel, and conduct finally launch their payload, do whatever they want to do with those drivers by simply exploiting them.
Okay, so we're talking about legacy systems here, things that may well be sitting within your security ecosystem that may have been a decision by your predecessors a long time ago, but potentially now may be vulnerable to.
Yes, so there are some older drivers. Every new driver you need to create, it has to go through quite a process of approving its quality. So there's like Windows hardware quality labs from Microsoft, and the Microsoft needs to sign a new driver as well. But Windows still, because it's so much based on the backward compatibility, has and will load the legacy drivers by default. And so there are many tools. Some people developed it at the beginning of the century or whatever, that are still in use in many places, and they may have those drivers, and the drivers will be loaded. However, the threat actors also identify those products which are vulnerable. So what they do is they only take one piece of the product, which is the driver, and then they pretend to be that product they load that driver into the memory of the operating space. So when the attack starts happening, you usually have one piece of code that starts running, which we call a dropper or whatever the initial piece of code. And then that code will bring the driver, will drop the driver, and that's why it's called bring your own vulnerable driver. So the driver is not necessarily present on the system. The driver is brought by
Yeah.
the threat actor within the tool set they are deploying. And so the driver is dropped and usually loaded into memory like any other driver. And once when it's loaded, the threat actors can then exploit weaknesses in the driver and then simply, either launch some code or maybe add their own another driver which is not signed into the memory of the kernel.
Yeah. So in the blog that you and our colleagues published recently, you went through 3 of the major payloads that you investigated. So we've got local escalation of privileges, we've got loading of unsigned kernel code, and we've got bypassing EDR software. Would you be able to summarize a couple of takeaways for what you found during your investigation there?
Well, when we looked at the vulnerable drivers, we obviously went from the point of view of the threat researcher, and so we wanted to understand, and also explain to ourselves in a way, and by explaining it to ourselves what's happening with vulnerable drivers, we kind of hope that we can also help other people to understand if they're interested in that topic. So we looked at various threats, and we looked at the vulnerabilities, but also how those vulnerabilities are exploited. And we came, as you said, with those 3 points. One is the local privilege escalation, the other one is termination of EDRs most commonly, and the third one is, I don't remember now.
The loading of unsigned kernel code.
Exactly. So loading of your own driver, more or less. You can basically also load what is known as shell code into the kernel memory, and then that shell code can make some changes. So you can also load the code, and that code may escalate the privilege of your process as well. So you have more privileges on the system. But the actual unsigned code in the format of a driver, of another driver, of malicious driver, usually will be put in place to hide the presence of other malicious components on the systems, like a rootkit.
Right, so it's that defense evasion tactic that they're really this tool is being used to help them hide in the system whilst they go about doing whatever mysterious and devilish deeds they want to do.
Absolutely. And the EDR is a quite logical thing, the termination of EDR as well. The EDR made a lot of progress in the recent times. We are able to see so many events happening in the system, so it only makes sense for threat actors to silence, so to call it, the EDR, so you don't those events that we can generate, that the defenders can use to detect that something bad is going on the systems, will not be generated if that kind of tool is deployed.
Yeah, it's that constant cat and mouse game, isn't it? You think
Absolutely.
you've got them, and then they change tactic. So you spoke earlier as well about how it's there's a lot of commodity type actors, ransomware actors, who are taking note of the availability of tools that can exploit vulnerable drivers. So we've, I think, was it January 2024 we first saw them enter this domain. Could you talk about a couple of the most prolific ransomware groups that are currently using BYOVD, and how they use this particular technique within their attack chain, as it were?
Yes. So specifically, well, this work was mostly conducted by James. I will quote James, and he's basically documented this. In January, it started with Kaseka, and when we talk about ransomware, most of the times the ransomware tries to exploit those vulnerable drivers is by basically deploying something which will disable disable EDR or disable security software. So in case of Kaseika in January, they were deploying another security software driver, in fact, which had another type of vulnerability, which was insufficient permission controls. So the idea behind that is that every time you develop a driver, there is also a security descriptor language, which is then used every time you install the driver, which then controls what user can execute which parts of the driver.
Yep.
So if there are no, if you're a security software, then you must be able to say terminate other processes, other malicious processes. And so if this functionality exists in the code and it's not guarded enough, then there may be some other perhaps malicious process which can use the same driver to terminate other EDR software, for example. Right. So in this case, that's exactly what happened. And this is not the only security software that's used for that purpose. So there are different anti-malware drivers. Usually those vulnerabilities are now already fixed. But if you bring your own driver, you are still may be able to load it in some versions of Windows. So I think most recently what we've seen as well along the same lines, like one of those more prolific groups was Blackbyte in July, and they had like 4 different vulnerable drivers which they used. Most of them would be eventually used either for escalation of privileges or termination of anti-malware software. And also recent malware group Ransom Hub, which is one of the more prolific these days, similarly used something that's EDR kill shifter binary, which again is one of those tools that's main goal is to disable active EDR processes.
Yeah. Shout out to James Nutland for all of his ransomware research. He did a fantastic blog last year, which talked about I think it was 14 of the most prolific groups and the TTPs that they use, and then this like a whole attack chain. It's really, really interesting. And I guess this particular technique is all part of the ransomware actor wanting to stay hidden until they're ready to let you know that they're there. And that's when they've got all of the sensitive information that they think they need. They've got the bounty, as it were, and they're like, okay, we're ready. Let's let you know what we've got. So trying to disable any other security apparatus that potentially would.
I think it's very important for them to not terminate as such those security software, but still provide this notion for the administrator at least, so they feel that the security software is still running, and in that case they will still remain hidden. And of course they want to prevent any kind of detection of alerts happening, and that's very important for them.
Yeah. So you did mention that security within the Windows platform has improved to prevent the deployment of newly developed malicious drivers, but it's the legacy ones that are probably the biggest concern at the moment. So, do you have any recommendations for our listeners who may be concerned about potentially vulnerable drivers in their own systems?
Yes. So one of the things they can use is Microsoft's list of known vulnerable drivers. So there's quite a large configuration file that can be uploaded, and I think we provided this link in our blog post as well. And it can be used by Windows security application. Prior to that, it was Windows Defender Application Control, which basically prevents loading on any known vulnerable driver in the Windows system. So that's one of the simpler way we can protect. Of course, that doesn't mean that the new drivers or new vulnerabilities won't be disclosed. So we need to make sure that we have very good ability to monitor, at least on those most important systems in our organizations. So in that case, you can use tools such as Sysmon, which has a specific event ID. I think it's number 6 that gets fired every time any driver is loaded while the operating system is running. So you need to have the visibility of the drivers, or the visibility of driver loading as well. And I'm sure, like many of the EDR software, will probably have that ability to see when a new driver is loaded in memory.
Yeah. All right. Well, our listeners can check out the full blog at blog.talosintelligence.com. I'll drop a direct link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much, Vanja, for coming on Talos Takes and for sharing your research and obviously the team. This is a collaborative effort you and colleagues worked on. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we very much hope to bring you back for another episode of Talos Takes. And thank you very much to the listeners for tuning in. We will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, Hazel.